Today, we travel to the heart of Sudan through the voice of a woman who embodies resilience, vision, and radical compassion.
I sort of found myself coming back to it. I don't know, sense of responsibility. And so the grassroots, it's something within the fabric of the community itself because they rely on each other to bridge the gaps and fulfill the needs.
Our guest, Fatima Medani, is a Sudanese advocacy and policy consultant whose work bridges global power centers and local resilience. She is a fierce advocate for women-led movements that are reshaping the future of peacebuilding in real time. From mobile clinics to community kitchens, from trauma care to emergency response rooms, these women are not victims of war. They are catalysts of transformative change.
We talked about earlier the community kitchen, for example. These women, or these spaces at least, these social spaces of the community kitchen, they're not just merely to feed the people who are hungry, but they're also social spaces where people share information, where people coordinate their sites. These women inside of these places make decisions of supply chain, of nutrition balance, and also emergency prioritization.
In a world that often overlooks grassroots women as passive recipients of aid, Fatima challenges us to reimagine justice not as charity, but as co-creation.
Transformative justice in its heart is not fixing what's been broken. It's basically transforming the relationship and the first day.
This episode is a call to action to international institutions, listen to policymakers, share power, and to every listener, bear witness. The women of Sudan are not waiting to be saved, they are leading the way.
Women in Sudan, what they are doing in these community kitchens, in these emergency response rooms, they are underrepresented, but they are bridging the gap in the institutional gap that is happening.
This is Women as Agents of Change, and I'm honored to present Fatima Medani. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Women as Agents of Change podcast series hosted in partnership between the International Peace Bureau and 8 Billion Podcast. I am your host, Liza Florida. And as many of you guys know, this is a 9-part podcast series. And today I have a very special guest with me, Fatima Medani. So Fatima, welcome to the Women as Agents of Change podcast series. How are you doing?
Thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you for creating such a space. I'm really honored to be here today.
Thank you. Actually, the honor is all mine. As many of you have known, and I've said throughout this series, this is deeply meaningful journey for me as I've connected with many of these women on a deeper level behind in many of these recordings. So what I'd like to do is really create the vision of their messaging. And I'd like to start first, Fatima, with if you could share with the audience a brief background of yourself and your work.
Oh, thank you, Lisa. I'm going to talk about me, my experiences in a certain context, which is Sudan in East Africa. I was born and raised there basically my entire life. I never really truly thought about the idea or the concept of community because it was all around me in my school, in my friends, in my work, in my neighbors. The personal relationships between Sudanese people is very personal, and this interconnectedness kind of what create this sense of community. And this is something that I never really thought about up until I moved here to the US. On a professional capacity, I was engaged in Sudan in youth integration, specializing on youth integration on policy and peace building. Even after I resettled in the US, I continued my work, but more on a feminist lens. But I continued my work in Sudan. And this is why when we, had the conversation about my work in Sudan, I told you Sudan is my toxic boyfriend. Even though I went internationally and I worked in different fields, I sort of found myself coming back to it I don't know, sense of responsibility or a feeling of hyperfiction, maybe.
You know, I'll let the audience know when Fatima and I initially met outside because I like to have an opportunity to get to know them better. Fatima made me laugh so hard because she's like, Sudan is my toxic boyfriend. It's very, not necessarily unhealthy, but it
Yeah.
hurts you, but you keep going back to it. Um,
Yes.
and that was the context she was referencing to. But, you know, could you explain to us a little bit more, not necessarily how it hurts you, but explain a little bit more in detail why you are so passionately dedicated to the grassroots efforts of that work?
So, as the nature of the Sudanese community, it is very self-reliant on each other due to this interconnectedness between them. And so the grassroots is not something foreign, it's something within the fabric of the community itself because they rely on each other to bridge the gaps and fulfill the needs that they need on their maybe daily basis and on
Yes.
their general. A foreign concept of groups coming together to help the community due to this social fabric. What made me come back after navigating the international affairs is actually the effect that I've seen in my communities and the community of my country in general of these grassroots and these initiatives and how they somehow shape their environments because of their experiences.
Nice. So then, as we had a conversation, we were talking about how a lot of these grassroots efforts and initiatives are women led. Could you actually go into detail about the relationship of that, how these grassroots efforts, how they're women led initiatives? Could you
Mhm.
share? You were talking about even before the war that
Yeah.
a lot of these initiatives were actually driven by women led, or they're women,
Yeah.
excuse me.
Okay, so yes, prior to the war, as I said, these groups and women groups specifically were filling institutional gaps. They were basically tackling the same things that formal mechanisms do not tackle, which are the safety, emotional, mental, and psychological support. They're tackling care and they're tackling food security and community protection. Basically, this is on a very abstract kind of point of view that what these feminist organizations were doing prior to the war. And when the war and the conflict erupted on April 2023, that of course put a lot of pressures on these groups because they are decentralized. They don't have a head. They don't have a CEO. These groups could literally be a group of the neighborhood. The neighborhood girls decided to like, oh, we actually do not have access to clean water, so might as well do like fundraising and dig a well on the field. It could be that easy, or it could be just a group of these same group of girls having access to sexual and reproductive health tools, for example, for the same neighborhood. It could be on a very small aspect and it could be on a very broad aspect, but nevertheless, the impact is there. So when the war came on April 2023, this, of course, as I said, put a lot of pressure on these groups. Some of them dissolved, of course, because they did not have enough access either to funding or they did not have a safe access to conduct their operations. Some of them kind of adapted to the conflict and changed how they operate in order to bridge maybe emergency needs. And most of them truly adapted, and also new groups emerged after the conflict and in order to tackle the new challenges of the conflict and etc. So women-led groups, organizations specifically, when we're looking at it on a feminist level, when they're operating, they're still operating on these same focus points that the formal mechanisms can't. But they respond to the needs with quickness. They are very quick and
Yeah.
effective mechanisms, And they are also, it's a system that is built on trust rather than law or punitive actions, you know.
Got it. What critical needs are grassroots women led groups addressing today that formal mechanisms are unable to meet?
So I think that the examples that I mentioned, which the maybe the 5 or 6 categories that we're talking about is which is the safety first, and I'm gonna maybe focus on a little bit more about
Yeah.
how safety is very important for the creativity of women. So the safety, the mental, psychological, and emotional resilience, and care, community protection. These are the very abstract focus or areas that usually formal mechanisms do not address very well, but feminist organizations are very successful in. But when I talk about, for example, a very specific example, for example, in the case of Sudan, you see that it's in most of the areas in Sudan, it's very conservative based on Islamic beliefs. So women rights and sexual health regulations are not very much in place. This is a huge gap that the feminist organizations are working on. So, for example, they would provide sexual and reproductive health tools. They would also enforce and push policies toward sexual SRHR regulations. And in addition to that, they also meet the very small needs that the community might need, such as feminine hygiene products, because it's still a shameful topic up until this area in rural areas. So the needs differ, but it's still not needs that met by formal mechanisms. Whether this reason might be political, it might be cultural, sociological, economical, it does not matter. What matters is that these needs are not met
And are
by the
met.
formal mechanisms. Yeah.
Got it. Can you share then innovative examples of community driven peace models that have emerged from and within these local groups? I know you talked about it. Is there
Yeah.
any additional examples that you haven't actually shared that might be of help to the audience to learn to understand what might be unique to observe you or serve Sudan?
So I'm going to share actually an example of a group that I've been part of for a while. It's called the resistance committees. So basically, the idea of these committees emerged in 2013, but at 2019 regrouped and restart our operations. But the goal was political. The goal of these committees is to organize, lead political demonstrations against the ruling regime, the oppressing ruling regime of 30 years in Sudan. It was a decentralized movement. We did not have a leader. These groups mobilized each other in until they had a structure. So basically, each neighborhood would have a committee. This committee is very secretive. You're not supposed to say that you're a resistance committee member, otherwise, you will compromise the entire group of your neighborhood. And basically, this group of young women and men would come together, decide how the next demonstration is going to look like, what time is it going to start, what type of logistics do we need? Do we need medical aid? Do we need hydration? Do we need like masks to cover our mouth and nose from the gas steer? Do we need goggles? Any type of logistics that we need in order to stop or prevent ourselves from the state violence that would endured for the demonstrations, because any demonstration in any place, it needs political instability. So the wave of the demonstrations started from December 2018 and continued up until April 2019, which was duration filled with violence, detention, torture. These groups endured any type of violence that you could ever think of. to stop them from being together, from just holding these demonstrations that where basically more and more people started joining in, and more resistance committees started to form until we successfully made it in April 2019 into a national sit-in where just everybody in Sudan basically who were able to made it into one space, which was the Air Force headquarters. And we just basically organized the sit-in, which was interesting because the sitting lasts for 2 months. The sitting became more of a community. There are tents, there are kitchens, there are medical tents, there are everything. And we were like, okay, we're not going home until this government is gone, which we succeeded on April 6th. We succeeded at sitting the government, the original goal. It was, but a lot of innocent people paid the price high because outburst of the sitting was very brutal. Many women were sexually assaulted. Many people were killed and thrown into the Nile River. It was very, very bad situation. 2019 up until 2023, these groups we played low key because that time was very politically mellow. These groups maybe some of them dissolved and stopped operating. I was one of those because the situation was unclear. There was no transitional government. There were, and then there was another coup. It was very politically messy situation. So with me, I was among the people who stopped, but some others integrate their activities into other things. They continued, for example, bridging some of the needs of their local communities. Up until April 2023, the war erupted and a lot of these movements, some of their members were displaced, me myself included. A lot of them were lost their lives. A lot of them were detained. A lot of them lost their homes. Um, a lot of them from an operational point of view, they lost the access for the operation field or their office, if they had any. Of course, the financial burden became unstable. Even the international funding became unsustainable. And there were a lot of pressure um, put on these groups. And in addition to the national pressure of bridging the gap created by a conflict in the country, because the international community was able to bridge only like 27% of the humanitarian need of the conflict. What do you think bridged the other 70%? These grassroots initiatives.
Of course.
Going back to the resistance committee again started to re-emerging, but they kind of reshaped themselves and reshaped the goal because the now goal is not political. The goal now is developmental and humanitarian. So they kind of changed their objectives and emerged as emergency response rooms. What these rooms typically do is that they basically the same work, but they bridge the gap according to the need. So whether the need little be health, there would be clinical mobile health clinics. It is education. They would create schools and psychotherapist support. They would create food. They would also have like another initiative is also called community kitchen, where just basically people cook, and then whoever needs food come and pick up this food. So it's the same mechanism of responding very quickly to the crisis and building this relationship with trust, because the only way that these groups are funding, or the majority of the funding of these groups, is via diaspora people who were able to manage to get out of Sudan and want to help their friends and family, people who were already established outside and were able to help their friends and family. They would not donate to an international NGO, but they were 1,000% donate to these grassroots because these relationships are built on trust. So Basically, this is just one example of one model that I see very successful in the resilience strategies that they use to every single time come up with new strategy and new ways to step up.
It makes so much sense. When you're in a community, you know each other. There's a
Yeah,
camaraderie, there's relationships that are closely built. Only you will know whether it's a village, a tribe, a community, how to care for one another.
yeah,
And
exactly.
therefore, that's why you're saying that sometimes there's this massive gap from the international level because unless you're there, like boots on ground, you won't really understand their needs.
Exactly. And this is how um, these national and local models bridge the gap that formal mechanisms do not. Because these formal mechanisms are built on the concept of community,
Exactly.
but they're not built on the actual context of what's actually happening and how these relationships are built into the idea of transformative justice. Because when, for example, an international donor comes to want to help um, elevate the situation in Sudan, the question should not be how can we help? The question should naturally be who is doing the work and how can we support them
Yes.
on their terms. This is the heart of transformative justice. In its heart, you're not fixing something that it's broken, but you are creating the space for sustainable work and action to be created or to live, to be there, or to continue. Exactly. Yeah. The power dynamics should not be you take these relationships between the two and you transform it. You transform this relationship into something that's going to benefit the both. So stop calling women in Sudan beneficiaries. Stop calling them recipients. They are the co-creators of this trade and they are equal partners and peers. It's very important to shift this narrative, to choose another one, not to think, oh, these people are poor, poor them,
Yes.
conflict happening, but to choose the other narrative that these people are strong, are creative, are doing amazing work. Why is no one else talking about it? Because this presumption of these communities are actually thriving in ways that should be studied
Correct.
never actually get into enough spotlight. The enough spotlight gets when they're dying, they're getting sexually assaulted, their homes are destroyed. Yes, all of that is happening. But why can't you talk about what's actually really happening to sustain the sanity of these groups?
Correct.
Who is doing the work?
Yes.
Looking at this narrative changes everything because now you're not looking to say out loud what is bad, but to choose to say out loud what is good. You have the choice to do that. I can come here at this podcast today and choose to say women in Sudan currently are being raped every single moment. The RSF are killing like hundreds of people in rural areas. I can say everything that ever is happening in Sudan, and it's all could be negative.
Yes.
But this would be my choice. My choice. This would be my angle. I did not. I don't want to. I don't want to choose that. This is if I have a choice, I don't want to
I
be part
agree.
I don't want to be part of it. Not because it's not true, but because other things are true as well, but no one is shedding the light on them.
Exactly. And you know what's really interesting, and can I share with you from even a spiritual standpoint?
Yeah,
How we choose
exactly.
exactly to create the narrative is the actual reality the reality and the projection that we will create.
And this is the start of the cultural revolution. How are
Agree.
we actually going to change that if we just decided to, oh, I should change my perspective? But it needs work. It needs an actual work and action put out in the universe. And this is exactly how we're going to put it, not just by wishful thinking or by saying, oh, I'm really sorry for everyone who gone through this and my prayers with them. But actual spiritual work, it's very dirty and muddy, and it's full of tricks and tests, and it will shake your world. It is shaking my world actually to have just this conversation out on the open, but it needs to be done.
So, Fatima, one of the things that you just powerfully shared was that you want to position women not as victims, not as beneficiaries or as recipients, but as active agents of change, advocating for peace building from the ground up. How has this narrative shift impacted local efforts and international perceptions? And what does that transformative justice look like?
In order to dissect the different parts of these questions, I think we have to first address why is it important for this shift to happen. And I think this repositioning of women as active agents of change is a political and strategic one. When we look at the impact of this shift locally and internationally, if we're talking about the context of Sudan and we're talking locally, we're seeing that this shift kind of put women more in visible roles of leadership, and structures that were already there allowed these women to be in this leadership role, but more of the structures collapse. And this is what we talked about earlier when we said that, when I told you that these grassroots are bridging the gaps and filling institutional gaps. This is what I was talking about. So the structure collapsed. That's why such these women found themselves bridging the gap. So they kind of found themselves in a leadership position. And this has many ripple effects on gender norms and gender relationships and dynamics. It kind of made the social fabric a little bit stretchy for traditional gender norms and what is acceptable and what is not. And it kind of a little bit also changed the social imagination of who should be on the leader and who's allowed to listen to and who's not. For example, if we looked at the examples of these grassroots and how this narrative shift kind of impact them, if we looked at the emergency response rooms in Sudan, they are not just providing aids, for example, they are also spaces where they document human rights violations. They reallocate victims of sexual assault. They're providing shelter and protection. So they are providing shelter, they're providing protection. And also another example for another initiative also that we talked about earlier, the community kitchen, for example. These women, or these spaces at least, these social spaces of the community kitchen, they're not just merely to feed the people who are hungry, but they're also social spaces where people share information, where people coordinate their sites. These women inside of these places make decisions of supply chain, of nutrition balance, and also emergency prioritization. And there is a high level of operational sophistication that is underneath, but they are very under recognized and very underfunded at the same time. So I think the impact, the shifting of the narrative is already happening, it's already on the ground, and it's manifesting into different shapes. What I'm trying to say is that basically, if these women in Sudan, what they are doing in these community kitchens, in these emergency response rooms, They are obviously they are underrepresented, but they are bridging the gap in the institutional gap that is happening. For example, the humanitarian international organizations were not able to bridge. What they are doing is that they are transforming these relationships. And this transforming of the relationships is not about correcting what's right and what's wrong. It's basically just fairness. Transformative justice in its heart is not fixing what's been broken. It's basically transforming the relationship that
Correct.
allowed harm to occur in the first place. They're not saying for the international community, like, hey, you do not give us enough funding so that we cannot operate. But they're saying that with the little bit of funding that we have, we are pretty much able to operate and survive and basically thrive. So
Uh,
how about you adopt the models that we have? And again,
correct.
transformative as its core, it's basically not when someone comes in trying to ask, hey, how can we help? But who is already doing the work and how can we support them?
It wasn't about coming in and bringing in all these different programs and the way that they saw
Yeah,
how Sudan was operating. It's more of we have it, we have these initiatives, we have these programs. We've created it based upon us knowing each other as community, as family. And we know in that aspect what's best to serve us here. Now,
exactly.
instead, could you take that and make us partners?
So if you think that we are so close to the problem, might as well it only makes sense that we should be so close to the solution, right?
Correct.
But this is not the reality. However, these initiatives at the end of the day, they find themselves dealing with frameworks and fundings and decisions that they were not part of making. So that does not make them so close to the solution. And this is the equitable partnership part. This is what I try to say in the part of, oh, transformative justice has to go hand in hand with
Yeah.
uh, sustainable partnership and equitable partnership, because they can happen, they will happen both in hand in hand.
As you shared with us more of the local efforts and the initiatives that have, that have taken place, how has this now moving into more of the international spectrum and the role perspective there? Could you share with us a little bit more about how that plays a role?
Um, well, I think on the international level is where we have a mishap, where this shift is not taking place as much as we want to, because unfortunately, most, especially when it comes to formal hierarchies and relationship between institutions and grassroots, unfortunately, up until this day, most institutions work on the outdated model of, that models that rewards victimhood rather than recognizing agency as the main component of partnership. And because of that, and because of this stuck up narrative and outdated models, it's very dangerous, because it's this models continues a lot of things. They continues how much money goes to these grassroots, who gets visibility, and where. What about the allocations of the resources and all of these different components that the grassroots and these women deal with, but at the same time, they are not part of making. And this is the exactly where transformative justice comes into place, because transformative justice is technically is not about repairing, and it's not about fixing what's right and what's wrong. It's about transforming the relationships that allowed the harm to take place on the first place. So this is exactly what these women in emergency response rooms and in the kitchens are doing. They are transforming the power dynamics between these groups. They are changing the narratives even quietly. The donor recipient framework is inherently built on imbalance. Basically, it says that one part holds all the knowledge, holds all the resources, and all the power, and the other part is a recipient who's usually passive and voiceless. Basically, because the donor recipient framework is a framework that is built on imbalance. It's hold the assumption that one part holds the power, the structure, and knowledge, and the other part is basically the recipient, and they are usually voiceless. And this type of narrative, as I said earlier, is dangerous. Why? Because it strips away the agency of these women and kind of flatten their role that they're due to keep their communities and to keep their movements thriving. One part usually have most of the power. This is not partnership. It is now a power. It's an issue of a power dynamic, and this is why dismantling this whole system and this shift exactly in the narrative of from the women as active agents of change. This shift needs dismantling all of the all of this system. So, as I said, this framing this is not only misrepresentation of the reality that's on the ground, but it also strips away their agency and put them on a victimhood lens. And dismantling such systems can only occur through equitable partnerships.
What would a truly equitable partnership between international organizations and grassroots women led movements look like to you?
Well, first of all, it starts with humility, especially on institutional humility, when it requires international actors to recognize that expertise is not confined in policy briefings, as I said, or global north in general. It lives in the day-to-day negotiations that women are making to survive and to organize and to lead in the context of extreme danger. And so the equity in the partnership here in this context is not just including the local actors in the process, that because we're including them in a process that's already been designed elsewhere, but it's more about co-creation from the beginning. It means reimagining every stage of engagement, from priority setting to funding design to implementation to accountability. So, in other words, we can say it's more about shared authorship because, as I said earlier, if you think that grassroots women are very close to the problem, then might as well they should be the closest to the solution. And lastly, I think what really equitable partnership means to me is also the redistribution of risk and responsibility. Why is that? Because too often, grassroots women are expected to take an enormous responsibility. Um, and I'm talking about delivering services, managing crisis, and sustaining, their community in general. While the international organization remain control over the timelines and the budgets and the reporting frameworks. But in equitable models, the risk is shared. So that could mean providing either core funding rather than just project based, or trusting the local timelines, which already happens, by the way, in the time of conflict. and also be willing to adjust the expectations when context shift.
Well, with that, you're currently conducting a needs assessment to better map grassroots feminist movements in Sudan. Can you share what you've uncovered so far and how you envision this data helping drive systemic change?
Basically, we're trying to understand the status quo of the organizations and that they are operating in Sudan, whether they were operating before the war or they start operating after the war or they stopped. They were operating before the war and then they stopped because of the war. We're basically trying to understand their resilience strategies and then the reasons on why they are what they are. If they stopped, why did they stop? What circumstances led to their stop? If they continued, why did they continue? What kind of support did they receive because they continued this support? What kind of a donor relation is taking place and what kind of power dynamics has been changed since the conflict started, and all of information trying to understand the status quo on operational wise and also on resilience strategy wise, and trying to make the experiences of these grassroots as documented as possible, and then trying to withdraw some resilience strategies and lessons from them in order to influence the next step, the influence the policy making, which is the step 2 of the project, the advocacy stage, which is will be the stage where we influence the policies based on the data that we derived from the needs assessment. So we're basically saying, hey, we know what grassroots organization are doing, what are their needs, why they do what they do. This is the best way to approach this, and then basically go from there.
Oh, wow, that's really such an innovative approach. And I can see why there are still probably different layers to that you can't really share right now, or because it's still unfolding right now in terms of the needs assessments and the
Because,
research around
uh,
it.
because also studying such a complex subject is very,
Mm.
it has very multiple layers on it.
Yeah.
Because, for example, in Sudan, for example, I've talked about the context that's happening. Usually, if there is a need, then this need is met by the community, which makes each group kind of a social group in of it themselves. Each group is a grassroots. So who is actually introduce themselves as grassroots, who consider themselves grassroots, who consider themselves organization, who consider themselves feminist, who consider themselves a social enterprise. These names, for example, here in the US, it's very much defined. You are a social enterprise. That means you have A, B, and C. You're an organization. That means you have the A, B, and C if you're a group. But such labels do not
Don't
have
apply.
these parameters in Sudan as much as they do here. So, in order even for us just to know the group that we're trying to understand, I mean, even just the language that we have to develop during these needs
Right.
assessments. So there are a lot of layers, and who consider, even we run obstacles on who we consider a feminist organization or who
Yeah.
can a youth-led organization. What is the gender distribution factor, and how is the age group factor plays into all of that? So it's
Ooh, it's quite an undertaking. How do you see peace building strategies emerging in Sudan as a potential model for other conflict zones globally? And if so, how might they be adopted across different cultural contexts?
it's an interesting question because I don't think that it kind of negates the point of transformative justice as being very flexible towards the needs of its certain community or the community that it serves. So I think maybe as a concept, yes,
Mhm.
absolutely. definitely. It can be translated, but it has to be fit into different that community needs into what that context fits. And I'm quite sure it's gonna reproduce a whole different model that already
Right.
exists in different parts of the world. You know, in Philippines, you have a different model of that. In most areas of the world, there are different society movements because there are communities everywhere. And wherever there are a community, there are some sort of alliances being made to bridge some sort of a need or a gap. Whether this should be formalized or structured, whether this alliance is political or social or culture.
The whole podcast series was all about women of agents of change. Which women or feminist movements have most inspired you? And how has that inspiration shaped your approach to advocacy and leadership?
I think there are a lot of the feminist movements in general is a very inspirational feminist. It's a very inspirational movement to me, not because it's such a perfect movement, but in general because it's a movement in and of itself. It's flawed, and women are learning and growing, and this is something that I will forever be proud of. But in general, when in my context, particularly fond of a local initiative in Sudan called AMNA, which is basically Amina in Arabic means safe. It's an organization that's basically creates a safe space for women. AMNA, it's basically, as I said, is an organization that operates in Sudan that works on to prevent gender-based violence and violence against women. And they work on basically mobilizing community in diverse way. Their work is phenomenal. They started from the very scratch and then build their way up. I will forever be inspired by their action.
If this is a platform that you could share with the audience globally and it reaches people, what would the message be that you'd like to share as an active women of agent of change?
I think the message is that what we're saying and what we're trying to convey is not what I'm saying, and what I'm trying to convey is not about fairness. It is about integrity. Basically, it's about what's right is right, and it's about also telling the truth. So we're not asking, hey, we're very poor, please help us. This is not fair. We're trying to tell the story as it is. So this is the truth. Who is actually doing the work? Let's put let's remain honest, and let's be honest and see things on the right perspective rather than the narrative that has been shared, and we've been transferring it robotically without really and truly asking the real questions on why such systems are in place, who's behind that, and what are people doing to actually thrive in such communities.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That was very beautiful message that I know that you really wanted to share and convey. Would you have any parting words for the audience in terms of maybe even women and the role that they're going to be taking in the 21st century?
I don't think that there are any right and any wrong in the roads that women are
Um,
take to take back their own agencies. I think we're all allowed to make a little bit of mistakes, and we are all allowed to show a little bit imperfectly.
Yeah.
all of the time. So just the fact that they are doing is enough for me.
Right. No, and I just wanted to say thank you so much for being so open, trusting, and authentic throughout our whole process, while also sharing, like you said, the work, the grassroots efforts, the initiatives, really going into detail with
Mm.
all that you could from a perspective of what you were able to share.
Yeah.
And so I want to say thank you so much. You know how honored I am to be able to share this vision of the work that you do in Sudan. And I'd like to, you always know you will have my support. And through this podcast, you would gain the support of many others that are wanting to come forward. So thank you, Fatima Medani, for being a part of the Women as Agents of Change podcast series.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I really appreciate you again for this space and all of the wonderful things that I've learned about you throughout the way.
Thank you. So, thank you to the audience for tuning in to this episode with Fatima Medani. We'll see you on the next episode of Women as Agents of Change.